Thank you all for coming here. My name is Ken Kungania. I'm the Executive Director of the National African Student Association. And I think we're here for a very important discussion. Everything that we've kind of set up in terms of the discussion topics to breakout sessions will be very, very informative to all of you. So just to kind of give a little bit overview of the National African Student Association. So we are an umbrella organization for a lot of African student associations. So we've been in existence for the last 5 years, still growing as an organization. And today, we're very proud of all the work that our team, our partners, NYU, African Belle, and a lot of, also all you attendees, just being able to just kind of help in, chip in, give your feedback. We'll take time out of your long weekend to be able to come over here. So as an organization, our goal is to basically help develop leaders who are going to be basically resources to the whole development of the continent. I think as a diaspora, we tend to complain here and there about different things, but it's time to start working on solutions, right? So we want to build a movement where, as a diaspora, we are at the forefront of some of these discussions, and we're not just kind of letting things slide and just complain about them when we're at our homes or in our communities or anything else. So just a quick overview of the conference. So today is all about movement building and working out how the diaspora can, as I mentioned, be that resource for that development of Africa. So today we'll touch on a little bit of obviously some gaps here and there, but today is all about focusing on what are the solutions that we can do as a diaspora. And I think we have a very, very amazing basically schedule set up for you, all of you. And as a movement, it cannot be a strong movement without strong individuals in that movement. And that's why tomorrow, Saturday, we'll focus on basically member development. And a lot of sessions you'll see are basically geared around that, whether it's as a student, basically where you are, ensuring that whether you're trying to transition into college, transition into a job environment, whether you're trying to transition in the US, there's sessions that can very well impact you and make sure that as a member, you're strong and you're strong within this movement. So again, I want to thank the NYU Office of Global Inclusion. They've been a very great partner to us. I want to thank NYU Africa House. I want to thank NYU Global Programs, African Belle, Kawi Energy Group, also Postmates at providing sponsorship for the lunch. I want to thank also NYU Accra, NYU Abu Dhabi. Yeah, so appreciate all of you for coming. Just take time, listen, bring in questions. This should be a very engaging conference, and that's what we want you by the end of the conference to take out from this. So bring your ideas, question everything that you've had, learned in the past, and let's try all learn from each other. Thank you. Appreciate it. I welcome Derek Kayongo.
Good morning, everyone. I should say bonjour as well, because we have some French speakers, and if you're Portuguese as well, we have Spanish Africa. So welcome, everybody. I wanted to begin, before I introduce our friend Lisa Coleman, Dr. Lisa Coleman, with a few remarks that should sort of guide us through this wonderful time that we're here to work on. In the annals of time, Africa's narrative has been woven with threads of struggle and triumph, of resilience and adversity. Today, we gather as champions and agents of change, poised to sort of bring about transformation. And I must remind you that every movement has never begun with crowds of people. It has always begun with one or two ideas. No longer can we afford to be trapped by the chains of complacency, therefore. Nor can we be content with rhetoric and mere echoes through the corridors of power. The time actually has come for us to be bold and to activate ourselves as a union of friends, brothers and sisters. The challenges we face are enormous, and one of them happens to be extreme corruption. Your continent, ladies and gentlemen, is infested with an unbelievable problem. And that is that we lack leadership that has vision. We lack leadership that has this whole idea of loving our people. Because before you lead, you have to love. And if you don't love your people, therefore, you don't understand the beauty of protecting them. And so today, as we begin with this small group of people, I must remind you that Africa is not to be joked with, to be toyed around with. Her people are important. We're 1.4 billion right now. And the more we get oppressed, the more we get loved, the more we give back. And so, as we begin this conference, and as I bring over Dr. Coleman, I want us to remember that it is not so much that we wonder about where is everybody. In fact, today is an analogy of where everybody is. Not concerned. Not concerned. And so, as we prepare ourselves to talk through these ideas, let this be a marker of us being concerned about the great continent, which is 3.5 times bigger than the US, which is the home of the lion, the home of the zebra, the giraffe. We have a lot to account for. Those ecosystems are dependent on you and I to speak up. And to speak up today, I bring to you a lovely lady in Dr. Coleman, who loves a lot of fun, adventure, and many things. But she is, of course, the Senior Vice President of the DEI division here at NYU. Before that, she was at Harvard University as a Special Assistant to the President. And before that, she was at my alma mater at Fletcher or Tufts University. Has 3 master's degrees. Who does that? 3 master's degrees from the great Ohio State. And of course, here is where her doctorate resides. So before I do that, please give me a chance to give a big warm welcome to our friend and host, Dr. Coleman.
Well, good morning. And I know some of us will be joining from other parts of the world, so it will be evening for them or afternoon. So I'm so glad that you all could be here today. I am going to, I do have some slides, and so I'm going to get those loaded up. And can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, so the first thing I want to do is actually just thank some people, all right? So The first thing I want to do is thank, of course, Derek and Ken and Danica and, of course, all the partners that Ken mentioned, some of whom I don't even know, Postmates, et cetera. So thank you to all of those individuals who've helped make this conference possible. And this has been an incredible partnership. But I'd like to ask two people to come to the front. And Deborah and Agochi, can you come here, please? Please come to me. So one of the things about my job is that I get to work at this amazing institution, but amazing institutions. You heard I got to work at Harvard, NYU, et cetera. But it doesn't matter where I am. I get to work with an amazing group of students. And these two students planned with our partners the whole conference. Okay? Like I'm standing up here and people later are going to be like, oh, Dr. Coleman, that was just a wonderful conference that you planned, that you did, et cetera. Do you know what I did? I asked them to help me. And then I planned orientation, because this week is orientation for us at NYU. So I went and planned orientation because I had to do this other job. And these two individuals planned this conference. Soup to nuts, runs of show, contacting speakers in Abu Dhabi, in Accra. They worked for weeks with these individuals to get this together. So can we give these two individuals a round of applause? This is Agochi and Deborah, and I cannot say enough about them. They're both graduate students and just got, thank you, oh yes, for the recording. Yes, from Wagner, yes. And so they're at our Wagner School of Public Service, and Deborah just graduated, actually. So I just have to say, fantastic, and thank you. Do you want to say anything? No? Okay, all right, thank you. And I also want to thank our partners here at Stern, and Fallon, who's not in the room, and all of our partners at Stern, the tech team, all the people who will clean up behind us after we leave and who set up. Can we give them a round of applause? Okay, so Deborah and Agochi gave me a task, and I always follow what my graduate students tell me to do. And so my task is to have an inspirational talk about excellence in the African diaspora, and not to be too boring or to go too long. Okay, so we're going to see how I do, and they'll probably, I get to grade students, but they'll probably grade me afterward. So before I get started, I like to situate myself and just say a couple of things about myself. So last night, as I said, we have our orientation program, so I was talking to the incoming class of 2027. So they will graduate in 2027, they're first-year students. And so I was talking to them about that I love higher education. And part of the reason I love higher education, as I've just said, is I get to work with students. And last night I was talking to a very broad audience. So I started talking about sort of excellence as sort of we think about diverse constituencies. But today what I'd like to talk about is a little bit about Black and excellence and people of African descent. And of course, I'm going to try to be pithy. So I'm a person of African descent. I'm classically defined as African American. My roots go back to one of the only free towns in the United States, and it was in this place called Mound Bayou, Mississippi. So that my family goes back to those roots. Author by the name of Toni Morrison writes about that town. I have family in the Caribbean, and I have family in different parts of the continent. I have family in the Netherlands, and I have family in Germany. So Afro-Germans and Afro-Dutch. This is, of course, the product of migration, which we know, of course, lots of Africans and people of African descent have migrated across the world, and of course, intermarriage. I grew up in a place where I was blessed by my family, and my talk is going to be about the corruption of the narrative of the African diaspora. So I grew up in a family where I was told every day that Black people globally were the best. We were the strongest. We had survived things that in many ways many other communities had never survived. That we populated the earth and in ways that were unimaginable, and possibility and belief in the possibility of people of African descent. I was old before I started to hear some of the narratives of what I would call corruption of the narrative of Black people, basically Africa as a small place, right? Some place that's half the size of the United States or something like that. Or Africa as a country, right? As opposed to a nation. That there weren't people who speak Spanish and French and all kinds of dialects. So it was confusing. And then, of course, throughout my life, I've had the great pleasure of meeting people from across the world. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Africanness in the world. But as our dear colleague Derek said, this is a struggle about power, and it is a struggle about extraction, and it is a struggle about narratives of corruption. So when we look at corruption within, right, the continent of Africa, we have to ask what got us there, right? It's not just like we're corrupt. It's like what got us to this corruption, and how have processes of extraction and particular kinds of empire, colonialization, and of course, a deep paradigm of racial superiority. So I'm going to start now by talking a little bit about my slides, and I'm going to be actually hopeful by the time we get to the end, as opposed to not so hopeful. Okay. So when I'm talking about narrative corruption, what I'm talking about here is the pseudoscientific and anthropological and fictional accounts of the African continent and those peoples in the diaspora. So what I mean by that are images, right, the proliferation of negative images of people of African descent. As I just said, right, sort of misinformation about facts. And then we can think about that not just in terms of Africa, but also for people in the Caribbean, and where I'm going to talk about people in, excuse me, in the South Pacific as well. And then also, there's also this corruption of cultural practices, right? The cultural practices are somehow, for instance, sometimes it's argued that Africa continentally and countries are more corrupt than other continents, which of course is untrue. So when we're talking about the continent, I just like to give a picture. This is a little blurrier than I like, but it's big. That's just the point. And of course, lots of different countries, lots of different, and when Derek was talking earlier, if we think about from South Africa to Algeria and Libya and Egypt, right, very different cultures. And yet, there is something united about the ways in which African corruption, in terms of the narrative, has worked outside, particularly in the European and imagination and context. Africa, of course, is the cradle of humankind, and of course, life originated there, and we know this specifically refers to South Africa. Although this information often is also misreported, that somehow the cradle of life is not in Africa, it's somewhere else, right? Even though again and again research demonstrates this. The diaspora. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the diaspora because, and I should say this, I'll just do this right now. So when people are usually talking about the diaspora, they are looking at Africa and then they are coming to the east. So they're looking at South America, they're looking at North America, and they're really looking at basically what is the slave trade, the sort of triangulated slave trade to North and South America. But what I like to do is take us and talk a little bit about the African diaspora and the real African diaspora, which is also in the South Pacific. So I've spent a lot of time in the South Pacific. I travel for my role here. As Derek said, I'm Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion, and global is an operative word there. I travel around the world. And so I've spent a lot of time in this region, Papua New Guinea, I've been to Samoa, I've been to Fiji, I've been to Tonga, and what I know is that people of African descent are all over this part of the world, but not talked about, or talked about in ways do not connect them to the rest of the African diaspora. Of course, then we could talk about the Middle States and talk about the Caribbean and talk about the ways in which, right, this is often understudied in terms of thinking about the diasporic connections. And to go back to what Derek was saying earlier, when I think about the possibilities of Africanness, I often talk in my work about multi-sector connections. And what multi-sector connections, and so if we're going to solve the big problems of the world, right, problems of water, problems of electricity, we are going to have what I call multi-sector connections. And those connections are across industry, government, higher education, right, so different sectors. What I also think is if we're going to solve the big problems that face African peoples, we are going to have to approach this through diasporic connections. The extraction. Extraction, of course, Africa contains an enormous wealth of mineral and resources, as we all know, the world's largest reserve of fossil fuels, metallic oils, gems, and precious metals, and of course, the biodiversity and biological resources, particularly sitting in the equator rainforest, right, Central Africa, rival South America, etc. And what we know is that, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, that Africa continent is poised to be one of the fastest growing economies, particularly because of its intersection with what's next in terms of future oil production, future in terms of fossil fuels, and of course, mineral production. I talked a little bit just a minute ago about diasporic connections. What I would like to say here is just a little bit more in terms of language, and we have Renee Blake here in the audience, one of our professors. But if we think about language, song, dance, theory, math, music, etc., across time and space, there are lots of connections, lots of movies about these connections, how song has traveled to the Gullah Islands, how different practices have traveled across the diaspora. So now I'd just like to talk a little bit about the present. The African continent is home to the world's some of the fastest growing economies. In fact, 24 out of the top 50 fastest growing economies are in Africa. They're in terms of, and we're thinking of here of Botswana, Rwanda, Nigeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia. Africa is rich in natural resources. 30% of the world's reserves of precious metals, gold and silver, are in Africa. 75% of the world's diamonds are in Africa. The growing middle class in Africa, the highest concentration can be found in Tunisia and followed by Morocco and Egypt. And what we also know about the United States is the most advanced and fastest growing group of immigrants in terms of access to opportunities are African immigrants. They are outpacing other immigrants in the United States. The African population is young and growing rapidly. So birth rates are dropping drastically around the world, but we don't see that in certain places in Africa, and 70% of the people are under the age of 30. I spent a lot of time talking about new generations and how Generation Z and the Alphas will change our world. Thank God I'm going to retire. And so they will be our future. Investing in infrastructure, thinking about investment funds and fundraising targets, and we think about $2.4 billion in the latest fundraising as marked in terms of the previous years. And of course, China, of course, is beginning to invest in the African infrastructure, as well as, of course, the Russians. Mobile technology, of course, we've seen an advance of mobile technology, and sub-Saharan Africa is the third largest growing crypto market in the world. Rising up against corruption, as Derek mentioned, 59% and in 2011, and then again in 2018, that went up to 89% of people wanting to address issues of corruption in their countries and on the continent. Foreign investment, I just mentioned, and of course, outsourcing in terms of manufacturing is being done in Africa as well. So as we think about where Africa sits continentally on the precipice of the future, what we know, and I just said this in terms of African immigration to the United States, overwhelmingly the evidence shows that African immigrants make a positive economic contribution to the United States and contribute over $10.1 billion in federal taxes and $4.7 billion in state and local taxes, with a spending power of $40.3 billion. I've said this in terms of poised to be the economic regions, and of course the free trade agreement, which is a game changer, which has just been signed by 54 countries. And so as we think about that free trade agreement, that of course will allow for more global economy and global ecosystems. And so when we think about the infrastructure, of course, projects, renewable energy, transport, fossil fuel, telecoms, and water, these are the wars of the future. The war on water, the war on technology, of course, and thinking about fuel and how we will have fuel in the future. These investments and this cumulative investment, as you can see over time, is about that rising economic power of the African continent. And then lastly, I like to think about black futures, and Derek, you reminded me last night of space, and so I put a little astronaut on there for you. And so whether it's in Senegal, whether it's in Haiti, whether we're building black wealth in terms of thinking about the continent, whether it's coding, we have to start to really think about this future. I spend a lot of time, I'm an Afrofuturist. I spend a lot of time with Afrofuturists and doing that work. And so thinking about technology and the advancements that we've made, but more and equally important is in AI and robotics, and of course, space exploration. Afrofuturism, of course, is about the design and imagination. As we think about Afrofuturism, machine learning, natural engineers, deep learning. I was just recently in Ethiopia, and then I went to Eritrea as well, where I watched kids take computer parts from that were broken and create new computers. So the possibilities are endless as we think about the imagination and design and the possibility of global Black African excellence. I'm wrapping up. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time. I hope I didn't go on too long. You can see that I got directions to stop. And so I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me. And if anyone has any brief question, can I take one question? Do you have a question to go to? No? Okay. And then I will end. Thank you so much.